So Prime has you convinced to try to get everyone to say squeal, it sounds like, because you're saying squeal and my squeal.
Because he's right. I mean, it's when you think about it, it's the only possible pronunciation. Because it's not a sequel. Like SQL, it's too weird. And sequel is like, so what's the prequel? Do we need a prequel now? Is there a sequel? So squeal. Look, he's just right. And that's it, right? He's just right.
There's technically no problems with squeal besides the fact that it maybe just sounds a little ridiculous to most people.
But that's only until you get used to it. Yeah, if there's any Germans listening to that, like the only phrase I know in German is Ich bin Glauber.
Yeah.
Which means I believe, I am the believer. So Glauben, the verb means to believe. And then I am the believer, I guess. I don't know. I mean, maybe they're all trolling me. The entirety of Germany is trolling me. That's definitely a possibility.
Yeah, when I saw your name, I've assumed this whole time you're European because I could like recognize it was like a more European sound.
Yeah, I met a guy in Germany as well. He said he hated me because of my name, but his name was Jan Glauber, right? Okay. And he said before you started contributing to the Linux kernel, I could just look into the logs of your contribution and grab for Glauber, and I would find myself. But now you completely ruined that experience for me because now there's you. Because obviously he wouldn't do this with Jan. Glauber was his last name, right? Just that is my first name. But Costa is Portuguese, which is my last name.
Oh, okay. You said you're from Brazil, but I know like in Argentina, there's a lot of...
I was born in Brazil. Yeah.
In Argentina, there's a lot of like European ancestry there too. Because I know a bunch of Argentinians that have European last names, like very German very last names. Yeah.
Well, like I guess one of the most famous Brazilian persons there is, like Giselle. She has a very extremely German last name. I mean, that's not my case. Like my family, I think, is mostly Portuguese. Just my name is that.
Oh, okay. When did they go over to Brazil? How many generations ago?
Dude, how do I know? I was actually like, I'm going to get canceled for that one, but here we are. I actually had my Brazilian citizenship revoked. They don't allow me in the country. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Because I absolutely despise soccer. I hate it. So they said, get the F out of here. Don't ever come back. And I don't come back. I mean, I don't have a lot of cultural connection, so to speak. Mostly because of that, right? I don't like soccer, so... Who are you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm the same way. I'm like, at this point, I'm fully American. Like, I haven't been back to India in 15 years, maybe. I am an American citizen, but I think I forgot what it was, but I have this thing where I'm technically, the US doesn't recognize dual citizenship, but India is fine with it. So I think it's like my backup. In case something really, really bad happens, I do have a backup. But again, I have no real connection there at all.
Always good to have a backup.
Well, you were saying you're talking about you used to be you're a contributor to the Linux kernel. So I guess before we get into some stuff, like set a little bit of context. So you are now a founder of a company called Turso. Prior to that, you worked on something called Scylla, which I'm actually familiar with, and we can kind of talk about that a little bit. And as well as you were a Linux contributor. So tell me more about like how all that came together and kind of your career path up to starting to work on Turso.
Yeah, absolutely. So like when I started my career, like I didn't much care about startups or anything like that. I think in the environment that I was, it wouldn't have made sense anyway, but like I really liked open source. And I think we had some exchanges. You might have been part of some of them on Twitter. Like when I was doing open source back then, first of all, I didn't do open source because open source was the dirty word. I did free software. Right. So I was actually a member of the Free Software Foundation and like Richard Stallman and all of the things like that. And I still think, by the way, that like if Richard Stallman, I don't know if we can curse or not, but if he wasn't such an asshole, we will probably be in a better position because like the ideas of free software are great. Just his personality is intractable. But anyway, wasn't in the original question, but like I like free software or open source, as we call it, the distilled version today. And I like the low level stuff. I was never too much. I mean, this thing about like the web and later on mobile, like it never attracted me as a developer. I always was fascinated with the Linux kernel and systems, like systems level software in general. And the moment I found, I can actually read the code for this stuff, that sold me 100%. So I started there, and I was still in school, so I was contributing. I have this story, and I try to find it just for Twitter's sake, where my first contribution to Linux kernel. Unfortunately, this happened in 2004, and I think the oldest thread that I could find was 2005, like an archive threads. So I couldn't find this message. My first contribution to the Linux kernel. This guy, I'll never forget him, Alvaro. He comes and say that this patch is wrong in so many ways. It has only 3 lines of code, but introduces 7 bugs, and it should never be allowed close to a computer again. So I mean, that was my first introduction. Like Linux is known to be like this very welcoming place, right? I don't know if it's better or not today, but like I did this for anyhow. I got super sad about that, but I didn't let it affected me for a couple of days, but I kept doing it. And I just started contributing for fun and giggles. Obviously, I mean, I liked it, so I wanted a career out of that, but it wasn't clear at that point. So I started doing it. Eventually, got hired by Red Hat. So I worked in total in the Linux kernel a little bit before Red Hat. I had a small job in a company in Russia. That's when I moved to Russia, which I did to work for this company for another 2 years. But in total, I spent like 10 years doing this. And one of my major things that I did in the Linux kernel was I was a part of the KVM team, the virtualization, the hypervisor that AWS today uses. And I got to be very good friends with the creator of KVM. And when they started a startup, then I said, hey, maybe now is the time for me to stop looking into just like, hey, code, and go work in a startup environment. I don't think at the time I would have worked very well in like a general purpose startup. I mean, it was a very heavy infrastructure startup, so I joined. We were trying to do something that did not work at all. So we spent a lot of time doing that. That was called OSV, which was an operating system, like a library OS, just for Dimension. And then after that didn't work, that company pivoted into Scilla. So that's how I ended up with Scilla. At the time, I knew nothing about databases. You could argue that I still don't. It's always you could argue. I mean, why not? Just it would be fun. But that's how I got introduced to like the database world and etc.
Yeah. So I think that's maybe where it's not that our paths crossed, but I guess your work crossed me at least. Yeah. So I was pretty early on in my career at the point. I was working at a company that was just collecting a ton of analytics data. And we deployed Cassandra. That was back in the day, like deploying Cassandra meant like running up your servers and like creating the cluster, like doing everything. It's not like there was a managed Cassandra. Actually, there was a managed Cassandra option. I'm forgetting the name of the company. Was it DataStax?
This training one? No, DataStax did manage. DataStax was the main company. They did manage Cassandra much later. That was InstaCluster.
Oh, InstaCluster. A bunch of other companies. Yeah. InstaCluster, yeah. That's the one.
Good guys. The super good folks.
Nice. Yeah. But at this time, we were kind of just running it on our own. And I was like, and I think I've had a weird career. Maybe your career is also maybe a little bit non-traditional. I spent a lot.
To say the least. But
in terms of like databases, I think most people, when they start to build stuff, they will use like a relational database and they'll spend most of their career there. And maybe every once in a while they'll like interact with like a non-SQL type database. I had this weird inverse path where I mostly worked with non-SQL databases for a long time. And only more recently I've been using SQL focused databases.
So look, my career, I think, is even weirder than that, because before I used a NoSQL database, I wrote one.
Yeah, that's funny.
Like I wasn't a user of that. Like eventually, which is why, like, honest to God, I mean, I think the founders know that. I'm still very good friends with them. I love them to my heart. But I considered quitting. Right, because when we were pivoting, I was like, "What the hell do I know about this?" I mean, like, it doesn't feel like I know about it. Like, so again, I was not the person ideating that we should build this, but we decided to build this, and I was like, I feel very out of place. 2 months, the first like 2 months after we officially pivoted, it was like really a bad time for me, because imagine that I came from this perspective, like I've done this thing that I know how to do for 10 years, and then I'm in this startup where like the whole reason I'm in this startup is because we're doing this, the stuff that I'm really good at, and talk what you want about, you have to be flexible, etc. Like after 10 years, you kind of get set in your ways, and it's also easier said than done. Eventually, I got to the point where, hey, look, now I'm in a good place. I'm cruising. But my first 2 months were like really complicated, man. But then I wrote a database before I even knew about one. I had no idea how NoSQL worked or anything like that worked.
Yeah, I mean, once you're 10 years into something, you're like used to being pretty good at it, and then when you have to shift, you now go from being used to pretty good.
This feeling is not easy.
Yeah, it's tough.
This feeling is not easy.
Yeah, but it's also like the most important thing to get through. Yeah,
I feel it today because I've been a developer, like a low-level systems programmer for 20 years now, if you sum up both, and I'm a founder. Like, what the hell do I know about being a founder? Like, no, nothing.
Yeah, it's a painful feeling, but it's also what prevents you from getting bored, right? I'm sure, like, you do anything for long enough, it's like there's not as many opportunities to feel like you're progressing. So those resets are good. So yeah, we had a Cassandra deployment, and I think that's when I think Scylla had just come out, or like it came out of base. I forgot what it was, but then it came across, and we were constantly. Oh, here's the other thing. So we did not know what we were doing when we first started using Cassandra. It took us a little while to understand the idea of partitions and hot partitions and how you should you data model stuff. So we definitely went through that cycle of doing it wrong, wondering why our cluster was like just dying. But also at that point, we were like, man, this model is interesting and it's useful, but I really felt like the Java aspect of it was kind of really killing us in a lot of ways. Just dealing with a lot of those side effects you have when you are running such like a large scale Java stateful thing. Yeah, and then Scylla was in C++, right? It was like wire compatible with Cassandra, and then but like under the hood, it was completely from scratch.
Yeah, C++, and then like I will never forget when we announced Scylla, there was this message on the Cassandra mailing list, like people commenting on it. And a bunch of people, man, this is the favorite reaction of the internet. Like there was a bunch of idiots, like, oh, you had another group of people claiming that they're better. How can they be 10 times faster? Because like C++ is and then you start CPU bound and IO bound and blah, blah, blah. Nobody deeply looked into that.
Yeah.
And then it's just like, oh, they must be running everything in memory. That's why it's faster. Like it just, man, and like the thing is that yes, we wrote the whole thing in C++, but then the architectural differences between Cassandra and C++ and Scylla were so immense. Like the 10x was usually the baseline. I mean, we were much more than 10 times faster. By the way, I'm watching Bun now.
Yeah.
With that feeling of like, hey, those guys are doing what we did to Cassandra back then. So I know how that story plays out, and like I'm wishing Jared here all the luck in the world. It's tough, it's hard. He's already starting to hear some of the things that we heard back then. Oh, you said this is drop-in replacement, but it isn't really because there's this different, and those differences will be there forever, right? So it's a tough fight, but it's a fight worth fighting because, man, like we need more efficiency in our lives, I guess. Yeah,
I know. It's definitely an important thing. And I think, especially when something new comes out, I talk about this all the time, people will point to things that are missing as though it's like relevant. There are some things in Bun that are missing, but there's nothing architecturally that prevents those things from eventually showing up. So I think people get hung up on.
We hit an issue with Turso running with Bun as well. So I mean, I get it. But what happens is like from the point of view of the person, like Jared or like us at Scylla, what you do is that you look at the market, you look at how people are using this, and then you notice that okay, there's 1,000 people that use this. This feature is needed by 800 people, and then I'm going to go and code that feature. This other feature is like needed by 10 people or 20 people, etc. So maybe I'll do this later. I'm not going to do it at all. So if 1,000 people try it and they say, well, I just dropped in and it worked, and then some other people try it and it doesn't work, like, is it drop-in replacement? I think it is, because I mean, so Cassandra wasn't drop-in replacement with Cassandra at times, and I guess Node has the same thing, right? You change something here, you change something there. So yeah, it's a different thing, but you know, at the end of the day, you can definitely claim it is.
Yeah. I think people get hung up on like the little details, but it eventually will be, and there's nothing preventing it from covering it. And that's kind of one of the nice things about selling into a market that's so clearly defined, like when you're doing drop-in replacement. Oh, yeah. People will just tell you exactly what you need to do and in what order. I think when you're building things that are a little bit more like brand new or it's not really established, you're constantly like, what do I do next? I have these 100 things that I can do. Which one do I do? Which one matters? The moment you have something so established, it's like the roadmap is clear. I mean, it's very challenging in a bunch of different ways, but the question of like, what should we be doing isn't, as prevalent. you worked at Scylla. Have you been there since then and you started Turso, or did you stop by anywhere else?
The full story is that like after in 2020, I left Scylla. So I knew I was ready to make the move. I mean, I've been there for almost 8 years and etc. But then in 2020, everybody remembers what happened in 2020. Right. So it just wasn't the right time. I was moving homes as well. I was moving to a different city. I had recently had my first kid. So I joined Datadog. And my plan, of course, like no joke, my plan was to stay at Datadog for like a couple of years. I said 2 years, 4 years, maybe let me get my full vesting, because that's the time. I mean, I never liked doing like a lot of job hopping, which is what I said. I've done almost 8 years of Red Hat. And then maybe I'm doing like they do with the popes. I mean, there is this story that with popes, like they have a long reigning pope, and then the next one they try to make it short. But then I've kind of did this by accident. So after 8 years of Red Hat, I had 2 years that I stayed in this company in Russia. Then I stayed 8 years with Scylla, and 1 year at Datadog. Again, I wanted to do more, but I think fate wanted this way. I had a couple of investors that were reaching capital in 2020 was really abundant, right?
Oh, I remember. And good times.
Oh yeah, good times. I had a bunch of investors reaching out to me, essentially, hey, if you're ready to start a company, which I always wanted to do, right? Just I'm ready to sign a check. I said, okay, like just, and then my co-founder and I, like we doodle on some ideas. The first idea that we hit was also not Turso. Like we started doing something else, which is super funny because I was always like, when I start my own company, I had this trauma of like the company that became Scylla doing this extreme, like very, very little validation, like just not, and if they done, I've seen none of that, right? And then we ended up pivoting because nobody wanted to use the product. Like they were like in your very wise words, the words that you are very famous for on Twitter, they had 0 users, right? After 2 years developing. So I said, the thing of when I have my kids, I'm not going to do like that same thing. When I have my own startup, I'm going to do tons of validation, which I did and ended up with 0 users anyway. So I mean, that taught me a lesson, right? To just easier said than done, and validation, and where do you look for those signs. So it's essentially an opportunistic thing. I mean, I saw the capital, we had an idea that we truly believed in. We thought, hey, this is a good idea. This is something that we want to do. And then I talked to Pekka, I said, my co-founder, and I said, hey, Pekka, like let's do it, man. And just he was a little bit frightened, because Europeans, they're not as adventurous as we are. Like, but eventually we decided to do it.
Yeah. So I mean, the validation thing is really interesting. I did basically the exact same thing, and it's funny. Like you can know all this stuff, and then until you do it, you just make the exact same mistakes that you thought you were going to avoid.
I read later on, like, and I almost dislike the guy now. I'm kidding. I love him. One of my best advisors, Pete Hunt, the creator of React. If you're hearing that, as you know, I love you. I got borderline mad at him for not mentioning this to me before, right? But obviously, like he recommended me a book that I read. Again, recommended to your audience here, called The Mom Test. Have you heard of this book?
Yes, I know the concept. I didn't know it was a whole book.
Yeah, it's a whole book, and the concept is again pretty simple that I had never done before. Like if you ask people, what do they think of your idea? They're going to lie to you. So the book is about like strategies to extract the truth from a group of people that going to lie to you, because your mom, she's never going to say, oh, it sucks. Or it's a great idea. Oh, of course, it's a great idea. Go for it. But how do you extract the truth from people that are lying to you? And reading that book, I mean, I saw this story of many things that I've done wrong, many things that I've done wrong, because you think you're validating, like, because you're talking to a lot of people, because you're asking a lot of questions, but then everybody's lying to you. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, you're worse off by having tried to validate incorrectly than not validating at all.
Because now you're like very committed to a direction that's not maybe sound. Yeah, this stuff is so counterintuitive. Like another thing that I run into is I think what I see a lot is people pick like ideas that are too small. The emotions behind it kind of make sense. It's like you are trying to start something from zero. You got to pick a narrow area to focus on so you can like start somewhere. But you still need an idea that's huge. Otherwise, like you're just going to get stuck in this little tiny thing that, you're never really going to break into something. So that's another mistake I've made, where you got to make sure you start small, but your entire idea can't just be just that. Everyone listening, you can listen to me say this, you can hear me say this, you can think you understand it, but you're going to make this same mistake too. Nobody can save you time. It's just impossible. It's one of the hardest things that that you have to deal with. Maybe you want to give a quick description of what Turso is, and then we can kind of talk about what was so compelling for you guys to start it.
So again, we didn't start Turso. So the compelling thing was a different idea. So
Right.
the original project that we had was called Chisel Strike. I'm getting convinced. I mean, this is a super hard thing for us to admit because, like, as a founder, you kind of love your ideas. You always tend to think, oh, I have the right idea, but the wrong. This happened and this happened. It's easy to put blame outside, right? But I think I put the blame squarely on us. I think we ended up with what Y Combinator, and saw a great video of them, describes as a tarpit idea.
Right.
Like an idea that is very seductive. And then you look at the market and there is no established players. And then you think, wow, this is my opportunity. But again, the reason there's no established players is that people tried before and they got, they sunk into the tar pit. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but it was essentially, we understood we had a couple of good ideas as part of this tar pit idea. One of them was that SquealLite. It was a great database for like today's workload. Again, go back to MongoDB in 2010, like the web scale kind of thing. This kind of workloads that people run on MongoDB back then didn't grow that much. Like, so the workloads are growing, but they're growing very slowly. Like, people talk about data growing exponentially. This is true for some subsets of data, but the machines got a lot bigger. Like the MongoDB that back then, today you can have a device they rent from AWS with a terabyte of NVMe, like it's nothing. And big data back then was like 100 gigabytes, right? And so we understood, for today's workload, SquealLite is the thing to do, and it runs locally. The developer experience is the best possible, and it's super cheap, so you can really put it everywhere. And we knew that the edge was real. In a sense, because there's a lot of confusion about what is the edge and is this a runtime or whatnot. But from I didn't come from this industry, so this whole thing about edge runtime, this was news to me. I was looking into the edge as hey, this thing between the cloud and you.
Yes.
Right. So this is real. However you want to call it, this is how you get latency to this in place. So we knew this was a thing, and then we knew how those front end developers are all trying to deploy to the edge. Let's look into that. We knew SquealLite was part of the answer because MySQL and Postgres were not really up to, they were just too heavy. And we've done a bunch of stuff around that. We embedded Dino into we had something that was Dino plus SquealLite plus a bunch of stuff together, and that was Chisel Strike, right?
Yeah, gotcha.
Over time, we kind of noticed that again, we weren't really getting the traction that we needed, but the database part was super. People really liked it, and tells you a lot, by the way, about market and about there are some ideas that they potentially are a good idea depending where and from whom they come from. And what a lot of people told us is that, look, your idea is very confusing because you're claiming to be a code platform because there's TypeScript, but then but you're also a database. And where do I deploy this? I mean, is this something I deploy to Vercel? No, you deploy your front end code to Vercel, but then you deploy your back end code to us. So there was some confusion in there. And being just a database allow us to get the nice parts of that idea, like the parts that were resonating more of the people. Put this in a category. I mean, and the category thing, it matters for people who are thinking about creating your own startups. Matter a lot more than you would think it matters. So it's just which category that you choose to play. So it's a category that we understand as the founders. It's a category that developers understood. Lots of the resistance the developer had to point your URL to this service. When you say point this URL to your database,
right,
this resistance is gone. And again, we knew that SquealLite was the way to get this thing replicated everywhere at a low cost, which is what we specialize in doing, and go from there and develops locally. So the good parts, we took the good parts, so let's try to build a company now just on top of that. And that was a billion, trillion times more successful, of course. But
let's talk about this edge. So I also agree with the whole edge runtime stuff. I don't know if you remember or if you saw, I was very upset for a couple of days being can we stop it with this edge runtime thing? It's the worst named thing in the world. Everyone is so confused about it. Whenever we talk about it, they're wait, nobody understands, because some people think about it as the geography. Some people think about it as a runtime. And then the thing that kills me, that proves my point, is Edge runtime is a bad name if you now also release a product called Regional Edge Runtime. They just added the word regional.
Which I don't, yeah.
Just call it something else, please. But I think it's too late. I think it's messed up. The naming, I go crazy with the naming stuff because.
Oh, and there's more. The part that annoys me the most is that, like, application developers, put it this way, because I'm saying that because it's not a mistake that I believe I've seen people like you making, like people in infrastructure. So maybe it's just because like how Vercel and Cloudflare have been marketing this, but application developers tend to associate too much Edge with serverless.
Yeah.
So a lot of the things they say about the quote unquote the Edge are really limitations because of the serverless model, not because of the Edge. And then because of the specific platform. So you hear stuff like, Edge, on the Edge. So the other databases, for example, like the PlanetScale, Neon, for example, they claim we have an Edge database. Why? Because it talks over HTTP. Why does that make you an Edge database? Well, because the Edge only supports fetch. No, just no. The Edge, those specific places like the Vercel and Cloudflare, and it is not even true anymore because you look at Cloudflare, they're changing now their workers to do TCP.
Yeah.
Right. So what is an Edge database? And our response to that is that like an Edge database needs to be a database that replicates. So there are two things that makes the Edge for me. First of all, massive replication, because the Edge in any incarnation is that I'm executing my code close to my users. Boom, right? So if the data is far, you either not better or at worst slower now because you have many round trips to the database. Before it was simpler. Like the difference between deploying to the Edge and then I'm everywhere and deploying to AWS in 5 regions with 5 Kubernetes clusters is that when you do the latter, you're very aware of where your regions are. You're very aware of what's going where. Like those things are very explicit in your design. And I think when you think about the Edge, those things are transparent.
Right.
So you push your code out there, be it to a serverful Edge offering or a serverless Edge offering. And shit kind of just works. And you don't have to be thinking about where is my stuff right now. It is where it needs to be. So for me, an Edge database is not only a database that is replicated in a lot of locations for a reasonable price, but also a database that doesn't require you to worry about where my replicas are, how do I get there, which replica has which data. This does have to be transparent. So that's what we've done with Turso. I mean, it happens to be over HTTP because we were like, sure. I mean, if everybody thinks this limitation is there, let's do it, which it is in practice for those runtimes. But that's not the most important part. Right? The important part is how massively it replicates and how you don't have to worry about any of that.
Yeah, exactly. I think that confusion is definitely there. I think when I was writing about this, I pointed out, because a lot of people were saying like, oh, you can't deploy Node.js to the Edge. And I was like, well, here you use AWS Lambda at Edge. Okay, it's not like fully replicated like everything else, but that is Node.js. You can run Go at the Edge if you want, because they support Go functions. If you use fly.io, you can deploy whatever you want.
Fly.io can deploy whatever you want.
Wherever.
Exactly.
So I think the thing that kills me is the confusion, because it just makes communicating super inefficient. So like every single day among the millions of people in this space, there's like all these little misconceptions and confusions. And so that's why I'm like obsessed with getting naming right, because you can just save a lot of back and forth of time. People get into arguments because they just are misunderstanding each other too, right? So that stuff bothers me.
And for example, this week is it's the middle of our launch week. So we have launched 2 things. Well, more than 2 things, but like 2 things that for me are like very important. One of them, if you had checked out, that was our launch on Tuesday, the 26th, is embedded replicas. Right. So embedded replicas essentially allow you to get so Turso now becomes your primary. Your writes go to the Turso, and you can still replicate at our infrastructure, but you can also have a replica in your infrastructure, whatever you want, be on AWS, on fly.io, etc. So like this is for me like to some extent the real edge, because now it's like, hey, what is the closest point that I have to my user? I can put the database there, and this first of all is microsecond latency, right? Because you're running, but to do that I need a file system.
Right.
So this will not run on the Vercel Edge. This will not run on the Cloudflare Edge. But you can put like anywhere you want. You can put it on fly.io. You can put it on Koyab. You can put like really on a server that you want. And it even works with environments in which you don't have connectivity. if you have no connectivity, of course, that doesn't work. But if you have like intermittent connectivity, you come back online and then you sync to the primary. But from that point on, you have like local reads. So again, this is us taking stuff to really let's call it the edge of the edge. But this is also edge. This is also part of the edge. This is also part of, okay, how do I get my data as close as possible to my users, right? Just people were still running some stuff on AWS. So for you running on AWS in a specific region, the closest place to you is there. It's not like in my infrastructure, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. The other thing I think you mentioned briefly is I think people heard the word edge and they started to think, okay, everything is going to move to the edge. So they started moving their application code to the edge. But then I think you mentioned before, like if you're doing, let's say 3 round trips to your database, those 3 round trips are now really expensive, and your application probably is going to be slower. So I think
unless you move your database to the edge as well, but then again, it has to be actually moving the data and not just like database at the edge because it talks HTTP.
No, yeah, physics. Yeah, I think the metaphor I use is like imagine a string with a bunch of beads on it. One's a user, one's your application, one's your database. You move your application closer to the user and you don't move your database, you now have a problem. So you have to move everything closer. But even if you move your database closer, it's now further away from all the other replication nodes. And that's something I wanted to ask you about was with this model, kind of what are the new things you need to start considering, right? Because I think a lot of people that are used to like a single master database, they may not be used to considering certain scenarios that can happen.
My counterpoint to that is that lots of people think about a database with a single master. Yes, but they're usually thinking about that plus a cache. Like there are very few deployments that don't have some form of caching, right? So when if you're thinking about replacing those two things together, which again you don't have to, but you should, then things become a little bit easier. But to your point, like when you have a database in a single place, like every time you read the database, everything is 100% consistent for everyone at all times, in every place, in every situation. When you have something like what we're providing, then you have relaxed consistency. It's not that different than reading from a read replica from, like, say, Postgres or any other database that people are used to. That read replica can be a little bit out of sync, but depending on the model, which then is the model that we follow, you can never break a transaction. So in Scylla, for example, or Cassandra, which was full eventual consistency, as you probably remember, you never truly know what you're reading from the database. Like never. It's like those mutations are applied and they can happen out of order. And you write to 2 keys, and then this node, if you hit this node, it will have one of the keys, but it won't have the other. So like that is full like eventual consistency. And then you have a very expensive process running on the background that is finding those differences and merging those differences. That's not what we do, right? So what we do is that first of all, you can write from any replica. You can write, we don't talk too much in those terms because you can write from any node. In fact, we only give you a single URL. You have the single URL and you're automatically routed to the closest location. So you can always read, you can always write from those locations, always. But the writes always go to a proxy that we consider the primary. Right? So if you happen to hit a quote unquote replica, the replica itself will write to the primary, wait for the write to complete, and bring it back. So as long as you're hitting the same replica, you do have this vision. So for the application that is like for the user, imagine you have a user in India. Like so the user, if you have a replica in India, very likely your user is always hitting that same that same location. So that person will have a fully consistent view of the timeline. The person who's hitting it from Australia may see data that is a little bit behind, but always transactional. This is called essentially snapshot isolation. So always transactional. A transaction is never broken. They're always applied in every replica in the same order. So you can be. It's similar to like if you have a long-standing transaction on a database. So the transaction is going on, let's exaggerate, for minutes. Like the clients that are coming before the transaction have committed, they haven't really seen the state update, right? So it's a similar thing. I mean, people who are in different locations, they are seeing an older state, but never out of order and always always transactional. If you say, oh, for this specific request, I absolutely need to see like the latest stage and etc., then you can force this request to go to the primary. You can read from the primary, you can pay the price. But you can have, so it is one thing that developers have to consider. Am I okay with this request at this point being, again, transactional, like in the same order that everybody seen, not missing any data until that point, but maybe a couple of milliseconds in the past. If you're okay, then read from a replica, right?
Yeah.
And if you're not okay, maybe again you should be using a central database, which is
yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean it's like the I forgot what they call it, like read after write consistency or whatever.
Read
like
after writes, yeah.
Yeah.
Read your own writes. That's what we have. Like read your own writes. So if you write and say if I'm on a replica and I write. This write will not be acknowledged until all the state has come back. So you're going to always read your own writes, right? Got
it. Yeah. Because I think that's probably maybe the most common case that people would run into. But yeah, very cool. So I am kind of curious. So are there certain types of applications that you guys see more often, or is it kind of widespread? Do all kinds of stuff like?
Yeah. So I mean, there is a couple of clusters forming, and again, this week we're hoping to expand to one more cluster. But first about like the ones that we already see, the applications that want to be fast from anywhere, right? So there are a group of people who, and one example, we have the use case on our website, a super fast site like triptojapan.com. Always talk about them because their site really is like incredibly fast. And like the first time I talked to their founder, he was like, look, I'm selling trips to Japan. My customers are everywhere in the world except in Japan. And I was selling those, you're going there. So I'm trying to sell you these personalized bundles. I think it's a very latency sensitive thing. I mean, I want to provide you I don't want customers giving up. I want to provide you with always a fast experience. And where, like pretty much everywhere. So deploying on Cloudflare Workers using Turso. The other thing that we see a lot are use cases where you essentially are a platform. So again, because of SQLite, because this thing runs locally, if you have an SDK, you have something that you want to ship to people, you put Dino's doing this. I mean, they're doing something similar than what we're doing. They just build their own infrastructure. But with us, you can have something like what Dino is building with Dino KV, except in much shorter time because we built a lot of the infrastructure as well. And one example that we have of that is Fermi on a WebAssembly platform. They're doing a similar thing. So you use their SDK, there's SQLite locally, everything works. You have the database is always there, so you can build those advanced functionalities that depend on the database. And when you deploy to their platform, then Turso provisions a database for you. Everything is API based. And again, the other thing that we hear a lot, and this is not, again, we don't have use cases with that yet, but people come to us and say, hey, you guys are SQLite based, and it's just a file. Why is it that you're limited to 3 databases in the free plan and 5 databases in the scalar plan, or 6 databases in the scalar plan? I want to write a multi-tenant SaaS application. And again, I heard this word from a variety of people. I did not know that this was a use case, right? Because it was like, maybe naming use cases is as hard as naming anything, but people would come with this specific wording, like I have a multi-tenant SaaS and I want to give a database per each customer, which is why yesterday we upped the limit. Again, we can go into the technical details as to why we did it this way and why it wasn't possible before, but we're essentially, as you can see on the website, we upped the limit from 3 databases in the free tier to 500 databases.
Oh wow!
And on the scalar tier, instead of 6 databases, I have 10,000 databases.
Wow.
And this should allow you, as long as you have users, of course. And so people who don't have users who listen to Dax, okay, you maybe only need a database. But as you increase your users, hopefully, then you can still give them a database per user and keep your costs extremely low. And we did this by making our platform itself multi-tenant, right? So the way we used to do is that every time you provision a Turso database, we provision a VM for you with Firecracker and etc., full isolation and etc. But then we moved to our server, allowing more than one namespace or more than one file per server. And now in the same server, you can have all of those files in. And again, if you're doing per user data, each one of those databases maybe have like a megabyte or
very small.
100 kilobytes or something like that. So they're very small. So provisioning a full volume for that database doesn't work. but like we essentially made everything multi-tenant, and now we can give you like this unreasonable amount of databases.
Yeah, it's very cool. It's a use case that I think is, like I said, it's very common. I worked at a company and we had that exact model. We used, are you familiar with LMDB?
Of course I am, yeah.
Yeah. So LMDB is very cool for what it's optimized for. It's just a key value store. Goes to a single file, memory mapped, extremely fast for reads. We basically had one of those per customer. We were in a compliance sensitive space, and it was actually very nice because we never had to usually get like a giant security questionnaire of like all these things. The moment we said you get your own database, half those questions they don't need to ask and they don't have to worry about. It's just something that makes people more comfortable. The other nice part is you don't have to handle the concept of multiple customers in your application code. So usually people need to remember, with every query I write, I need to make sure I add like where customer equals whatever. And inevitably you forget to do that in one place and you're accidentally querying stuff across customer. When you do it, when you have a database per customer, you just configure that in one place and then all queries are guaranteed to be limited. So yeah, that is a very cool model. And I haven't used that as much lately, but it is something that it's like very clean if you're willing to set that up.
Yeah, again, we just had to build it because again, going back to our previous thing about validation, this is validation, right? This is not me talking to a customer and say, hey, would you like 10,000 databases? So of course their answer is going to be yes, right? Of course, right? Who would say no?
Yeah.
Right? And then you ask them like, hey, do you think it's nice? Or what if I offer you this feature? They say yes, but do they use it? Yeah. No. Again, but what we had was with this feature in particular was a stream of users. You go to our Discord channel, this is there all the time. You go on Twitter, you don't believe me, you go on Twitter, you look for Turso, and there's a lot of people asking for this on Twitter, and they all asking the exact same thing with the exact same words. Like variance here and there, but like, hey, I want to do a database per customer. Intuitively, I think it should be doable in your model because you're based on SQLite and people are doing this with SQLite. Why can't I do it with you?
Yeah.
Right. So maybe I'm wrong and nobody's going to use this. The week is just getting started. But in my book, I mean, this is a lot more validation than the usual, like, hey, go and ask and see and talk and take notes. Because it was good. It was good on a personal level. That's what I mean. Like, just that taught me the real difference between like listening to your customers. There's one way to do it, and there's another way to do it, right?
Yeah, that's actually the best part of actually having users is just they'll just tell you and like demand things. And oftentimes you're always like, should we do this? And then you can just say, let's wait till people start complaining. And when they do, you have to do it. So it's funny. Like the hardest time is when you have no users because you're just by yourself in your head. The moment you have at least some, it just gets 100 times easier.
So this is why I like the stuff that you talk about on Twitter so much, because when you have no users, like, man, if I tell you the amount of stuff that we've done in the early days of Turso, because imagine that we were coming from a pivot, we were like, oh man, we screwed this up, what's up? Like in our mind, like the most important thing was, will people want this? Like we were not like we don't have another chance. I mean, if we come up with something that people don't want it, like, and we had the theory that people will want it because that's the part they like the most about the whole story before. But so what, right? Just if I don't build something that people want it now, I don't have another chance. That's what crossed our minds, right? So man, things that we didn't care about in the beginning. Will this service scale? Right. Like, what if I have 10,000 users? And I was like, look, I'm happy if I have 100, right? Just are things automatic? Like, it's another podcast just for me to tell the whole story of the kind of corners we cut back then.
Yeah.
And then when we saw, now it's picking up, or now the users are getting, okay, now we're going to sit down and we're going to re-architecture this thing, and the multi-tenancy is just one example, but you need to have users, and to have users you don't need Kubernetes, you don't need microservices, you don't need scaling, you don't need any of that crap, right? Just you need to put it out there.
Yeah, you need to get it shipped. And it's just like the thing that always gets me is it just gets so much easier. Like the hardest you'll ever work and think is very, very early. And like you have new challenges and new problems, of course. But for me, once a company is past that stage of like, is what the most miserable time is when you don't know if anything you're doing will ever be paid attention to by anyone. That's like the most miserable time. But you got to go through that. And I think for me, I think people have a lot of opinions and they talk about all these things. And I can kind of look back at younger versions of myself and see how I thought and see how I thought, like how I expected things to work. Then I look through how, okay, when I was actually in the seat doing this work, completely different. I became a completely different person and started to think the opposite of what I used to think. So with a lot of these things, it's tough to have these conversations a lot of times because I remember thinking a certain way and no one could have said anything to me. Nothing changed my mind until I was in that position and I like really understood.
Are we stubborn? Dex? Is that what's that?
I'm definitely a stubborn person for sure. I'm definitely a stubborn person. It's very hard to get through to me, but I think on some level it's true for everyone. You don't really understand until you're in the seat.
You know, one of my favorite movies is The Matrix, the original one, of course. Like not the. Let's not even talk about the last one or the fourth one. But there's this scene that stuff. I mean, I actually think they did it on purpose because there's a bunch of jokes in the movie about like a crappy sequel. So it's who knows? But there's the scene that I love in which guys Neo is like the chosen one, like essentially right as Jesus Christ figure who's going to come and save us all in the movie, and then has to take this jump from the building. And everybody's looking like expecting, everybody fails, right? Oh yeah, sure, everybody, but he's the one. So there's this expectation that he's going to succeed, but he fails nevertheless.
Yeah.
Right? So I think there's some things that you only learn when you do it. And because you think you know before you actually do it, but then like it doesn't match reality exactly as you thought. So you may have a good, foundation, but it's not a perfect fit. It's only a perfect fit after you go through it.
Yeah. There's so many times where I'm like, this is a principle. I know it's bad to do it. Companies should not do this. 6 months later, somehow I find myself, oops, I did it. Like it just, you think know.
I did it again.
Yeah. And then you just don't. So it takes a couple times. That's why.
Britney Spears will be a better startup advisor than a lot of people. I did it again.
Yeah. It's why all these things is all about being able to stick around for the long term. Kind of been doing this in the startup space for a very long time. I think the past maybe year or two, I think I finally feel like, okay, I think I kind of starting to get what this is about, but I've made the same mistake like a bunch of times for me to really get there.
By the way, the thing that we've done, one of the things that we've done, we had this thing in the beginning, like we knew we want to charge people per usage, not like VMs and CPU and etc. Like Planetscape is kind of backtracking on that. They're giving like now VMs, but we were hearing from the community. I mean, we may in the future, who knows? But we were hearing from a lot of people that they prefer just requests. Okay, so we're going to charge per requests. And we didn't have the time to build infrastructure to track those requests. Right?
Yeah.
And we were like, oh, but I want to put this out on a specific date. And like how long does it's going to take to build this? I just said this is again such a life lesson, man, because we hear about MVP, do the least amount possible, but until you're there, like you always say, oh, but we need this. This is super important. This is super important. It's only when you have the deadline and the commitment they start seeing that, you know what, this thing that I thought was super important turns out is not. And the request tracking was the first to go. We essentially didn't build any. We said you have a billion reads per month for free, and we never measure it.
Yeah, we are doing the exact same thing with our current product. Like we have a free tier,
never measured.
But if you go out of the free tier, we're not stopping you from accessing it. So
exactly,
yeah.
Because you start thinking like, why the hell would anybody care? I mean, like what I need now is just to validate that this thing is going to work and people are going to like it.
Yeah.
If they use $1 billion and chew, like, are they going to complain? No, nobody's going to complain. I mean, they would complain if it was the other way around. If I promised $1 billion and I gave you $500 million, right?
Yeah.
I'm giving you more, whatever, right? Just do it. And number of people who complain.
Yeah.
Number of people who noticed, 0. Like nobody noticed.
Yeah, the usage-based thing is big for me. I mean, like for us, we model our entire business on the idea of our costs being usage-based, and it simplifies so many things.
Yeah, but our cost is not usage-based.
Oh yeah, of course, because you're infrastructure provider. Yeah. So you have the challenge of translating from one to the other.
But that's a challenge that I'm having now, because now I projected the growth that we have, because we're seeing like 30 to 40% growth every month.
Oh wow!
In the platform, right? So from 0 users to 0 to no, just like but we're seeing like good growth. In the first 3 months, we were like, cost, just do it. we promised you like up to 9 gigabytes, which people misunderstand because it's really like 3 gigabytes replicated in 3 regions. So your database is 3 gigabytes, but gets replicated. So we promised you that, but we didn't have any code to auto scale you to that level. So we provision everybody with 9 gigabytes, right? And people use like 100K. So like our costs started to they are getting like completely out of control because we provision you VMs, but we're charging you per user. So there is a mismatch there. But now that I have a product, now that I know that people like it, now that I have my first couple of paying users, we have around like a 15 to 20 users on the scaler plan, and a bunch of other like free users in the thousands. Now is the time to go and let's rein in the costs and figure out the different architecture and start optimizing. Right before, it wasn't the time to. Even the multi-tenancy, like we wanted to build the server multi-tenant from the start. We knew it was a good use case. Like it takes a lot longer. Like in the VM stuff, you put a database there, provision, boom, boom, you're done, right? And now people are asking me. Now I know it's real.
What I would love for people to understand is you guys are paying that price, that cost, that effort of translating a VM to usage-based. That is like a fantastic service that you are providing for other people, because now anyone building on top, they're not being charged by you guys unless they are making money or like they're like doing some kind of operation that's useful. And I think people do not understand how magical and incredible that is. It's one of the big reasons why like we build everything on AWS. We have all usage-based costs there. It's amazing. Like AWS, gigantic company, does the crazy difficult accounting work of across all their customers, what do they need to provision so that they can charge usage-based. It's like it simplifies your business so much. And whenever you see a provider offering usage-based, you take advantage of it, because that's like, otherwise that leaks into it becomes your problem, right? If I'm running, if you guys aren't doing that, if I'm paying for like database VMs, I now need to do that translation, which is a lot harder because I only have myself as a user. You guys have, a bunch of users that you can distribute the cost of that between. So I love usage-based pricing. I like whenever I see that, I'm like, okay, that's the option we got to go with.
Yeah, and that's our Wednesday announcement, which will lots of people have been asking us that. Like, because what we have now is what we had until last week was a free tier, which costs you nothing and gives you certain allowances, and then a $29 a month tier, which gives you a lot more. Granted, so it's 100 times in terms of reads, it's 100 times more for $29. But what a lot of people have been asking us is like, what if I'm in the middle? Like,
right.
I wanna, right? But like we have our reasons, I think, not to go full usage based. Also because some people don't like it, right? Because of the predictability. So what we're doing is essentially allowing you to go over. Like, okay, so you and I'm gonna give you a discount if you commit to the $29 a month.
Yeah.
So I would charge you, for example, you have your allowances, and then I'm gonna charge you $1 per an extra $1 billion queries. Yeah. Now our free tier offers 1 billion. Our scalar plan offers you 100 billion. So if you are purely usage based until the 29, you're gonna be paying me $100 a month. But like what I'm doing is that I'm giving you the opportunity to spend 1, to spend 2, to spend 3.
Exactly.
Yep. Right. And then when you say, oh, now I'm crossing the chasm, and let me just commit for 29, right?
Yeah. And
on the $29, instead of this extra billion, instead of costing you $1, it costs you 75 cents. So again, I want people to upgrade. I want people to become paying customers, but we're giving you this initial ramp as well. Yeah,
the ramp is what's key, because otherwise you have these jumps like with other providers. Like it'll be whatever they're charging you, maybe supports 1,000 users. The moment you have 1,001, your costs have now like tripled. You might go from making money to losing money. Yeah, so the ramp of it, like the absolute price is fine. Whatever they're charging me for that tier is fine. But I want to ramp up there. I don't want to just go there because I had one extra user, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, those little things like that, I think, again, I think until you're in the position of it's your money that you're spending, you maybe don't pay attention to that stuff as much. But it just lowers so much complexity. Like, it's not about the cost, it's about the things you have to think about and things that you can avoid thinking about, which is what I really appreciate. Thank you for joining me. This was great. Yeah, appreciate it. I'm glad I finally got to chat.
Dax, thank you so much, man.